Well, here I am again, banished from the park. Across the street, though, there's a bus stop on Park Boulevard. And from there, I'm back inside a tree. It's a really comfortable seat. You should take a look at the tree. You can see the big old tree. I'm sitting between two huge roots. Hopefully it's not too bright. You don't need to look at me anyway. We're here at K71.htm, and we stopped off at A.B. Pippard, Cambridge University. He wrote Elements of Chemical Thermodynamics for Advanced Students of Physics. And he says, there is no justification for the view, often glibly repeated, that the second law of thermodynamics is only statistically true, in the sense that microscopic violations repeatedly occur, but never violations of any serious magnitude. On the contrary, no evidence has ever been presented that the second law breaks down under any circumstances. So the point is made, where did these laws come from? If evolution is true, they had to have been there before it started. The Big Bang Theory, okay, but we have those laws. And the Big Bang Theory goes by those laws. What brought the laws ahead before it came out of nothing? Well, Frank A. Greco, Harvard Medical School. Being a generalization of experience, the second law can only be invalidated by an actual engine. In other words, the question, can the second law of thermodynamics be circumvented, is not well worded, but could be answered only if the model incorporated every feature of the real world. But an answer can readily be given to the question, has the second law of thermodynamics been circumvented? And the best he can give is not yet. Now this is a law likewise that has been observed and tested for well over a century, and no exception has been found, as he goes on to say, this is the law. Now, how does that compare again with the two models of creation and evolution as an explanation of origins? Richard Morris, in his book, Time's Arrows, Scientific Attitudes Toward Time, 1984, a very well-known science writer says, the second law of thermodynamics has a chameleon-like character. It can be expressed in more different ways than any of the other laws of physics. The reason that it takes so many different forms is that it is the most general of all the laws that scientists have discovered. It applies to practically everything. So who's the lawgiver? And so we're not then about a principle that applies only to mechanical processes, as I've heard some claim. But like the chameleon that shifts colors, this principle likewise applies to everything. In particular, we notice the statement in the Dallas Morning News, May 14, 1990, regarding entropy of information. We have information about this. He's quoting Robert W. Luckey, Tom Siegfried, ex-director of research, AT&T Bell Laboratories, and John Wheeler of Princeton and University of Texas, Austin. Is there a real connection between entropy in physics and the entropy of information? Well, he's affirming that there is a connection, and that it is the same thing, and refers to the work of Robert W. Luckey at Bell Laboratories and John Wheeler of Princeton and the University of Texas. And he says the equations of information theory and the second law are the same, suggesting that the idea of entropy is something fundamental. Now, entropy is this tendency toward disorder, and it operates in practically every area. It is the most general of all the laws and includes information. I think the law of entropy, as it relates to information, is particularly relevant to the question of origins and evolution versus creation. Certainly, evolution of life and of complex organisms involves an increase in order and information. And perhaps quantitatively, we can get a better handle on this issue if we look at it in terms of whether there has been an increase or a decrease of information. We observe that there has been a general overall decrease of information in order of organization throughout the universe. In other words, an overall increase in entropy. And this is one of the most fundamental laws we've ever seen. And yet, in spite of that, We have statements like this from the V.F. Veisskoff, head of the Department of Physics at M.I.T. The evolutionary history of the world from the Big Bang to the present universe is a series of gradual steps from the simple to the complicated, and from the unordered to the organized, from the formless gas of elementary particles to the morphic atoms and molecules, and further to the still more structured liquids and solids, and finally to the sophisticated living organisms. Wow, M.I.T. Head of the Department of Physics. Let me get back there again. Calling them sophisticated is an understatement, Dr. Patton says in his commentary on this. In our earlier session, we pointed out that even the simplest cell has information content equal to hundreds of sets of the Encyclopedia Britannica, a tremendous amount of information. And yet that information degenerates. He says that the whole universe is governed by a principle that is onward and upward, including the information of organized systems. And this professor at MIT, head of the Department of Physics, goes on saying, there is an obvious tendency of nature from disorder to order and organization. I don't know where he sees that. American Scientist, volume 65. Well, how do you know that? The most fundamental generalization that scientists have been able to make says just the opposite. It says there is a tendency in the opposite direction toward deterioration and generation, including information. This has been observed and tested and repeated and measured for over a century, and now more. The second law does apply to open systems, in other words, the real world. A lot of people say, well, that's just laboratory stuff. Dr. Don Patton says, on tape number 2, some people, oops, can you see me better? Oops, got the sunlight in me. Oh well. Just listen to the words. Some people trying to avert or avoid the obvious implication of the evidence will say, but this second law only applies in closed systems. But we live in an open system, open to the extra energy of the sun. And when you have an extra energy, you can get an increase in order. Well, obviously we see the child that with an increase in energy in the form of food does grow taller, and the acorn grows into the oak. But I would affirm that it takes much more than energy to do that. But the statement that it only applies to a closed system is a false statement. Suppose the statement of John Ross of Harvard University, Chemical and Engineering News, he said, ordinarily the second law is stated for isolated or closed systems. But the second law applies equally well to open systems. It's stated for closed systems so that we can define it with equations that we can then balance. But notice also Arnold Sommerfeld in his college textbook, Thermodynamics and Statistical Mechanics. He says that the quantity of entropy generated locally cannot be negative irrespective of whether the system is isolated or not. Yes, it's defined that way. We see it that way in the equations. But it works in the real world, which does not involve closed systems, and the neat picture often presented by the equations. Richard Morris makes this comment in his book Time's Arrows. He said an isolated system is one that does not interact with its surroundings. Naturally, there are no completely isolated systems in nature. Try to be academic and limited. And yet, as we observed earlier, the second law operates in nature. It's the most fundamental general observation that scientists have ever been able to make. But there are no closed systems there. But nevertheless, he continues, everything interacts with its environment to some extent. Nevertheless, the concept, like many other abstractions that are used in physics, is extremely useful. Why is it useful? It contradicts. That is the closed system concept, which doesn't reflect reality anywhere, except in the textbooks. It says it does. If we are able to understand the behavior in ideal cases, we can gain a great deal of understanding about processes that take place in the real world. In fact, treating a real system as an isolated as an isolated one is often an excellent approximation. Of course, that's what physics involves, approximations. We approximate using closed systems, knowing that in the real world, where we observe this law in operation, that we are in an open system. So the statement that it only works in closed systems is obviously false enough, though we hear it quite often. Compare a quotation from Dr. Patton's notes by Charles J. Smith, Biosystems. I have to make this print a little bit larger. Biological systems are open and exchange both energy and matter. This explanation, however, is not completely satisfying because it still leaves open the problem of how and why the ordering process has arisen, an apparent lowering of the entropy, and a number of scientists have wrestled with this issue. Bertalanffy called the relation between irreversible thermodynamics and information theory one of the most fundamental unsolved problems in biology. He sees one thing, it contradicts the other, it's unsolved. Well, we'll find one. Well, that was in 1968. How many years is it now? Half a century? Isaac Asimov says in his book, Life Without Energy, forgetting the ideal, really, we can just take it for granted that in the real world about us, entropy always increases. And as we pointed out, entropy is the measure of the disorder of a system. But he says that in the real world that we live in, which involves systems only, entropy or disorder always increases. That's the way it is in the real world, and there are no exceptions. Wow. Well, he's a science fiction writer. Evolution requires an increase in energy and information which contradicts what is observed, the second law. Now, while we do sometimes observe things increasing in order due to, among other things, an increase in energy, that second law is not violated, because the energy comes from someplace else. There are only moments of increase of energy which by themselves do not create order increases in the overall curve of decrease over the life of that particular thing. The idea that since we get extra energy from the sun, and therefore can ignore evidences all around us of overall decrease in degeneration and disorder is vacuous and ignores the real problem. While energy is necessary to see any kind of increase in order, it is not a sufficient answer to the problem. Consider the statement by George Gaylord Simpson, a very famous evolutionist, in his book, An Introduction to Biology, when he says, the simple expenditure of energy is not sufficient to develop and maintain order. A bull in a china shop performs work, but he neither creates nor maintains organization. The work needed is particular work. It must follow specifications. It requires information on how to proceed. George Gaylord Simpson and W.S. Beck, An Introduction to Biology, page 466. So Dr. Patton says, when we look at information, which operates by the same principles of entropy increase, we see that it requires an increase of information in order to have an increase of order, not just energy, but in addition to energy, an increase of order also requires an increase of information. We look at the living system involved, for example, in the human eye. A tremendous amount of information is involved here. The curvature of the lens is described by information, and if that information is not accurate, then the lens curvature is not appropriate and the whole eye doesn't work. Now, how did that information come into being? It didn't evolve. Compare quotations from Don Patton's notes by Eigen, Nobel laureate, Evolution, page 13. Here at the molecular level are the roots of the old puzzle about the chicken or the egg, which came first, function or information. And we shall show neither one could precede the other. They had to evolve together. Crystallization occurs because it leads to the lowest energy level and to the most stable arrangement of atoms or molecules under the given conditions. Crystallization leads to simple, very uniform, repeating structures which are inert. These structures do not function and are not designed by function. Richard Morris, Times Arrows. For example, when a crystal grows in a liquid structure, it appears that was not present present before the process of crystallization began. As the crystal becomes larger, well,